The first body found in Belanglo State Forest was not recognized as part of anything larger. It appeared to be an isolated discovery in a remote region of New South Wales. Detectives who arrived at the scene treated it as a standard homicide at first, but the method of killing and the way the remains were concealed suggested planning, confidence, and a level of violence that immediately raised concern. In the days that followed, investigators reviewed missing person reports, mapped travel routes, and contacted families with recent disappearance notices. But no leads emerged. Nothing explained why the remains had been left in that specific section of the forest. At that stage, detectives still believed they were dealing with a single isolated homicide. But what they did not realize yet was that this single discovery would mark the beginning of an investigation far more complex than anyone in Australia anticipated.
You are watching Crime Insider. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a like on the video.
By 1992, what began as a routine call-out inside Belanglo State Forest had turned into a formal homicide response. According to the first police reports, officers located human remains partially concealed beneath branches along a fire trail. With no evidence suggesting a wider context, detectives focused solely on securing the immediate scene. Forensic officers established a controlled perimeter and documented the site using grid photography. Disturbed soil, surface debris, and the position of each visible item were recorded. According to the field logs, the condition of the remains required an extensive approach, and investigators held on to conclusions until specialists could examine them off-site. A small collection of personal items located nearby was sealed and logged for processing. Detectives reviewed missing person files only to check for possible identification. The priority at that point remained only to determine what happened at this location and who exactly was the victim. The remains were transported under controlled procedure for forensic assessment. Back at the forest, officers conducted a second sweep, documenting boot impressions, vehicle tracks, and anything that might have shifted naturally over time. But none of this early information offered clarity beyond the fact that a murder had occurred in a spot that had been overlooked for years. By that same evening, supervisors classified the case as a single isolated homicide with pending formal identification. No broader investigation was initiated, and no alternative theories were discussed. Everything rested on what forensic specialists would determine once the examination began. By the final days of September 1992, investigators had begun reviewing unsolved missing person files linked to travelers who vanished while moving between Sydney and Melbourne. According to early case summaries, several disappearances from previous years shared a consistent set of features. Each individual was young, traveling on a limited budget, and last seen attempting to hitchhike along the Hume Highway corridor. These similarities prompted detectives to re-examine files that had previously been treated as unrelated events. In the days following the initial Belanglo recovery, forensic examination formally identified the first victim as 22-year-old Joanne Walters, a British backpacker reported missing months earlier. Case records show the identification was confirmed through dental comparison and personal items recovered near the scene. The confirmation offered investigators their first clear anchor point in an otherwise fragmented sequence of disappearances. As the search perimeter expanded across adjacent fire trails, detectives located a second set of remains within the forest. Scene reports noted that the distance between the two locations suggested the same offender had used multiple sites within Belanglo. Forensic specialists later confirmed the second victim as 21-year-old Caroline Clarke, another British backpacker whose disappearance had raised concern internationally earlier that year. With two confirmed victims found within the same region, investigators shifted their focus from isolated tragedy to a potential pattern. Detectives reconstructed Joanne's last known movements using hostel logs, transport records, and witness statements. She had been traveling independently, with plans to explore the East Coast before moving south. According to missing person reports, she had not been seen for several weeks, and earlier inquiries showed no indication of voluntary disappearance. Her case now formed the foundation of the emerging investigative timeline. With Joanne and Caroline confirmed, investigators began re-examining other unresolved files for similarities. Two disappearances from December 1991 stood out. German travelers Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied had left a King's Cross hostel intending to travel inland. Staff described them as organized, well-supplied, and consistent communicators with family overseas. Their disappearance created concern across international lines, but with no confirmed sightings or passport activity after their departure, the case had stalled. Their silence resembled the pattern seen in the earlier files. When investigators plotted each case on a shared map, the alignment became difficult to dismiss. Every disappearance intersected with the Hume Highway, a major transit route connecting regional hubs with long stretches of isolated terrain. Internal analysis prepared that week suggested that the clustering supported the probability of a single offender, selecting victims from predictable sections of the corridor. Detectives reviewed witness statements collected at the time each traveler was last seen. Most accounts referenced hitchhiking or attempts to secure informal transport. The absence of consistent witnesses, combined with the transient nature of backpacker travel, created gaps in each timeline that were challenging to reconstruct. None of the individuals had backgrounds that indicated voluntary disappearance or unresolved disputes that might explain their silence. By early October, senior investigators briefed command that the combined circumstances formed a coherent and concerning pattern: young travelers on foot, identical transit corridors, and immediate disappearance after their last confirmed movements.
With 2 confirmed victims recovered inside Belanglo and 2 additional related disappearances now showing the same pattern, detectives classified the forest as the primary search zone for further evidence connected to all 4 cases.
By early October 1993, search teams returned to Belanglo State Forest with a structured plan to review large sections of terrain previously considered inaccessible. According to operational briefings recorded that week, the objective was to determine whether the earlier discoveries were isolated or part of a broader pattern hidden within the forest's interior. SES volunteers, mounted officers, and forensic staff were deployed in coordinated grids, each section marked for detailed examination. The first breakthrough occurred on 5 October. A search team located skeletal remains not far from a fire trail branching off the main access road. Forensic staff later confirmed the remains belonged to 19-year-old James Gibson. The cause of death was consistent with multiple gunshot wounds delivered at close range. Investigators noted that Gibson had disappeared nearly 4 years earlier, a detail that strengthened concerns about a long-term offender operating along the highway corridor. As analysts compared the injuries with those found on Caroline Clarke, they recorded significant similarities in ballistic characteristics. A second discovery followed within hours, when searchers located the remains of 19-year-old Deborah Everist. According to early scene assessments, Everist had sustained blunt force injuries and stab wounds, indicating a different form of assault from that used on Gibson. The variation suggested the offender adapted methods depending on opportunity and victim resistance. Items scattered around the site indicated the bodies had been placed deliberately rather than left where the assaults occurred. For investigators, the positioning supported a developing theory that the offender used the forest repeatedly with a high degree of confidence. On 1 November, the search expanded into another sector where ground disturbance had been marked during a previous sweep. Forensic teams recovered the remains of 20-year-old Simone Schmidl. According to the autopsy findings, Schmidl sustained multiple sharp force injuries, including wounds to the spine, a detail consistent with attempts to immobilize the victim. The presence of clothing fragments and bindings indicated controlled movement prior to death. Investigators documented these features carefully, noting parallels with patterns observed in the earlier cases. 3 days later, search crews identified a final site deeper within the forest. The remains belonged to Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied. Neugebauer had been restrained and shot multiple times, while Habschied displayed evidence of decapitation, with a skull not recovered despite extensive ground searches.
According to internal summaries produced after the discovery, this level of violence suggested an offender who maintained extended contact with the victims and exercised deliberate control throughout the assault. The recovery of 5 additional victims transformed the investigation. The timeline now spanned nearly 4 years, with each disappearance corresponding to a documented pattern of contact along the Hume Highway. The varying methods, gunshot, stabbing, blunt force, and restraints indicated a single offender capable of shifting tactics while maintaining consistent behavioral markers. Forensic technicians noted repeated use of rope or cord, deliberate placement of remains, and personal property either missing or relocated.
With the scope of the investigation now extending across multiple disappearances, police formally established Task Force AIR, a dedicated unit created to consolidate evidence, coordinate search operations, and manage all inquiries connected to the emerging cluster of cases. The task force brought together homicide detectives, forensic specialists, analysts, and regional officers under a single command structure.
By mid-November, Task Force AIR prepared an updated briefing to senior command. According to that document, Belanglo State Forest could no longer be treated as a location of convenience. The consistency of victim placement and offender behavior suggested it was a chosen zone, familiar and strategically useful. With 7 confirmed victims recovered, investigators faced a single unavoidable conclusion: the case had become one of the most disturbing serial investigations in Australian history, and the search for the person responsible had entered its most critical phase. By mid-November 1993, the scale of the Belanglo recoveries required a coordinated response beyond standard homicide procedure. According to internal directives issued that week, Senior Command authorized the formation of a specialist investigation unit designated Task Force AIR. Its mandate was clear: consolidate every disappearance linked to the Hume Highway, analyze behavioral and forensic patterns, and identify a single offender capable of operating undetected for years. The task force assembled investigators from homicide, forensic services, intelligence analysis, and geographic profiling. Their first step involved compiling a comprehensive data set drawn from hundreds of witness accounts, hostel records, bank transactions, highway patrol reports, firearms registries, and transport logs. According to early analytical summaries, each data point was assessed for temporal alignment with the disappearances of Gibson, Everist, Schmidl, Neugebauer, Habschied, Walters, and Clarke. The resulting chart confirmed what investigators had already suspected. The victims' last known movements followed a predictable corridor of transit used heavily by hitchhikers. Detectives then moved to reconstruct offender behavior using the physical evidence from Belanglo. The findings pointed toward a perpetrator who operated with confidence in isolated environments. The placement of bodies, repeated use of controlled restraints, ballistic consistency, and tactical separation of victims indicated a level of planning that excluded impulsive violence. According to behavioral assessments completed by consulting specialists, the offender likely possessed strong knowledge of the forest interior and was capable of transporting victims to concealed sites without drawing attention. Parallel to behavioral analysis, investigators examined firearm ownership across New South Wales. The ballistic signatures from Clarke, Gibson, and Neugebauer suggested a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle or similar platform. According to registry searches, thousands of rifles in the state matched the profile, but fewer belonged to individuals with regular access to the Hume Highway and surrounding work routes. This subset became an early reference list for cross-checking employment history and vehicle usage. The task force also expanded its focus to roadside sightings. Officers reviewed records from motorists who had reported unusual encounters across the prior 3 years. Most offered limited detail, but a handful described a man stopping near hitchhikers who were traveling alone in a utility vehicle along lesser-known entry points to Belanglo. According to intelligence notes, none of these descriptions produced a definitive suspect, but they supported the theory that the offender maintained a consistent presence on the highway network. By late December, analysts produced one of the most substantial documents of the investigation, a link analysis map connecting all 7 victims through geography, travel timing, and disappearance conditions. The map indicated that whoever committed the crimes had reliable mobility, operated without assistance, and likely engaged with victims under the guise of offering transport. Investigators noted that this behavior was consistent with an offender who blended easily into the flow of highway traffic, possibly through employment requiring long-distance travel. The task force concluded the year with a focused but limited pool of persons of interest. According to operational reviews, none yet met the threshold for an arrest, but several individuals showed partial alignment with the behavioral and logistical profile. The challenge remained the same: no surviving witness, no confirmed vehicle, and no direct physical evidence linking the crimes to a known offender. As the team entered 1994, the investigation stood at a critical impasse. Without a breakthrough connection, Task Force Air risked becoming one of the longest and most complex unsolved operations in the state's history.
As Task Force Air consolidated months of case material, one name, Ivan Milat, began appearing across separate inquiries. Detectives know that prior complaints, historical interactions with local police, and a work history that placed him along the same routes and time periods connected to the disappearances. Unlike other persons of interest, his background intersected with multiple elements of the developing profile, prompting investigators to examine his movements in greater detail. Several years earlier, in January 1990, a British traveler named Paul Onions had reported escaping from an armed man south of Sydney after accepting a ride along the highway corridor. According to the initial police notes taken at the time, he described the offender's vehicle, behavior, and a sudden escalation that forced him to flee on foot. The report did not progress then, but as Task Force Air reviewed older files, investigators recognized that elements of Onion's account matched features emerging in the Belanglo cases. His statement became one of the leads requiring reassessment as the suspect pool narrowed.
By April 1994, Task Force Air had redirected its resources toward the structured monitoring of Ivan Milat. According to surveillance logs initiated that month, investigators observed his movements from his home in Eaglevale to various work sites along the Hume Highway. The purpose was to confirm whether his daily routines, vehicle use, and personal conduct aligned with the operational profile derived from the Belanglo cases. Detectives documented each departure, travel pattern, and stop, noting that Milat maintained a steady routine in public but exhibited caution consistent with someone familiar with law enforcement procedure. Early observations focused on the vehicles under his control. According to registration checks, Milat had access to several utility trucks over the years, including models consistent with the description provided by Paul Onions. Surveillance teams noted that his current vehicle type matched the dimensions and style recorded in Onion's statement. Detectives also monitored his storage habits, observing him transport tools and personal items in a manner suggesting familiarity with concealed compartments. These observations supported the theory that he possessed knowledge of how to manage controlled environments during long-distance travel. Investigators then compared Milat's work logs with the timeline of the disappearances. According to records obtained from his employer, he had been rostered for road maintenance in regions corresponding to the last known movements of multiple victims. Dates from 1989 to 1992 aligned with periods when Milat was traveling independently for work assignments. Analysts noted that the intervals between recorded shifts and regional deployments allowed windows in which victims Gibson, Everist, Schmidl, Neugebauer, Habschied, Walters, and Clarke had vanished. The consistency between employment records and disappearance dates was recorded in operational summaries as one of the strongest circumstantial indicators to date. Additional monitoring focused on Milat's handling of firearms. Surveillance teams recorded instances of him transporting cases resembling rifle containers, though he exercised caution and avoided displaying weapons publicly. According to registry data, members of the Milat family collectively owned several .22 caliber rifles, any of which could be relevant to the ballistic evidence recovered in Belanglo. Detectives noted that Milat frequently interacted with family members, creating uncertainty about where firearms or related items might be stored. As the surveillance progressed, investigators maintained the need for operational security. According to planning notes, the risk of Milat becoming aware of the monitoring was considered significant. Detectives also recognized that any sudden changes in his behavior, such as vehicle disposal, rapid relocation of property, or abrupt work leave, could compromise the case or endanger civilians. With this in mind, the task force began drafting search warrant applications supported by the lineup identification, vehicle correlations, and employment timelines. By early May, enough corroborating material had been gathered to justify coordinated action. By the morning of 22 May 1994, Task Force Air had positioned teams across several Milat family properties as part of a coordinated operation. According to the execution plan authorized that day, the goal was to limit any possibility of evidence being moved between households. Tactical officers approached the Eaglevale residence just after 6:30 a.m., confirming Ivan Milat was inside. Entry was made under warrant, and Milat was taken into custody for the attempted abduction and armed offenses reported by Paul Onions 4 years earlier. While Milat was transported for processing, forensic teams began detailed searches of the property. According to the first inventory logs, investigators recovered multiple camping items, knives, and personal effects later matched to victims found in Belanglo. Several pieces of equipment, including a water bottle, backpack components, and clothing fragments, were identified as consistent with items carried by travelers who had disappeared between 1989 and 1992. Detectives noted that these belongings had been stored in locations suggesting deliberate concealment rather than casual accumulation. Parallel warrants were executed at homes belonging to Milat's mother and several siblings. According to recovery documentation from those sites, officers located a tent, sleeping bags, and additional personal possessions confirmed to be linked to the victims. One of the most significant findings came from a relative's property, where investigators discovered a camera traced directly to one of the backpackers. The presence of victim property across multiple locations raised questions about whether the items were knowingly received or simply passed among family members over time. No evidence at that stage supported charging relatives with involvement in the murders. Inside Ivan's bedroom, detectives recovered parts of a Ruger 10-22 rifle and ammunition consistent with the ballistic characteristics recorded in several Belanglo cases. Although the weapon was not recovered intact at that address, the components offered early support for potential linkage to the shootings of Caroline Clarke, James Gibson, and Gabor Neugebauer. According to forensic notes, investigators also seized ropes, ties, and cutting tools considered relevant to binding and injury patterns documented at the recovery sites. As the searches progressed, detectives conducted initial interviews with family members. According to those transcripts, none provided statements implicating Ivan directly, though several acknowledged that he frequently carried weapons, traveled alone, and spent time in isolated bushland. Investigators documented these remarks to support the behavioral analysis already underway. The interviews also highlighted Ivan's pattern of shifting belongings between residences, creating additional challenges for the forensic team, now tasked with mapping item origins. By late afternoon, investigators completed the first-stage evidence assessment. According to the operational summary issued that evening, the volume of property linked to the victims provided substantial grounds to escalate charges beyond the Onion's offenses. Detectives recognized that the material recovered served not only as corroboration for the attempted abduction, but also as direct physical evidence, positioning Ivan Milat at the center of the backpacker murders. With Milat in custody and multiple forensic teams now cataloging items from each property, Task Force Air moved into its next phase, a systematic review of the offender's history, relationships, and behavioral patterns. The objective was to determine whether the man arrested that morning had acted alone and how far back his violent conduct extended. By the end of May 1994, investigators shifted from physical evidence to Ivan Milat's historical record. According to the initial background briefings compiled after his arrest, the objective was to determine whether his prior conduct aligned with the patterns documented in the Belanglo murders. Detectives obtained archived police files, employment records, and court documents dating back decades. What emerged over the following days reframed the case from a series of disappearances into a long-standing pattern of violence and control. The earliest entries in Milat's record originated in his juvenile years. According to juvenile files accessed through restricted archives, he had been implicated in multiple break-ins, car thefts, and property offenses. Although many cases were finalized under youth provisions, investigators noted the consistency of behavior involving coercion, weapon possession, and disregard for authority. These early incidents were documented as indicators of a trajectory that escalated significantly as he entered adulthood. A more substantial development appeared in a 1971 file involving two female hitchhikers. According to the historical statement, both women reported being taken into a vehicle at knife point, restrained, and subjected to a serious, non-consensual offense later categorized as SA. One victim managed to escape, and both provided detailed accounts to police. Milat was arrested and charged, but before the matter could proceed, he staged a false suicide by leaving belongings near the gap and disappeared for several months. According to the case notes, procedural shortcomings eventually led to the charges collapsing, and Milat re-entered normal life without a conviction. For investigators in 1994, the behavioral parallels between this case and the Belanglo offenses were immediately significant. Interviews with former colleagues further reinforced emerging patterns. According to statements taken during the week after his arrest, Milat frequently discussed firearms, bushcraft, and hunting. Several co-workers recalled him spending time in forests alone, particularly during periods when he traveled for roadwork projects. These accounts, when compared with the forensic characteristics of the Belanglo scenes, supported a view that Milat possessed both the competence and the geographic familiarity required to carry out the offenses without detection. Investigators also examined financial and communication records. According to bank logs spanning several years, Milat maintained irregular spending habits typical of someone living independently with minimal social obligations. No entries suggested gambling issues, debts, or external pressures that might explain a sudden escalation, supporting the theory that his conduct stemmed from long-term behavioral tendencies rather than short-term triggers. By the end of the review, Task Force AIR compiled a multi-page behavioral chronology charting Milat's progression from early offenses to the sophisticated violence documented in the Belanglo cases. According to that internal report, the elements were consistent: control, isolation, access to weapons, opportunistic targeting of hitchhikers, and a capacity to manage victims in remote areas. The historical record did not resolve every question, but it provided investigators with a framework demonstrating that the man in custody had exhibited patterns of conduct long before the first known backpacker disappearance. With the forensic evidence from the raids now supported by decades of behavioral and logistical context, Task Force AIR prepared to widen the inquiry further. The next step was to examine Milat's personal relationships, not only to understand his conduct behind closed doors, but to determine whether earlier forms of violence had gone unrecognized until the Belanglo investigation brought them into focus. By early June 1994, Task Force AIR shifted focus from Ivan Milat's public history to the environment in which he lived. According to interview schedules prepared that week, detectives began meeting with former partners, relatives, and individuals who interacted with him in domestic settings. The objective was to determine whether patterns of coercion or violence observed in earlier files had also appeared within his personal relationships. What emerged through these accounts provided investigators with a clearer understanding of Milat's behavior long before the Belanglo murders. The most detailed testimony came from Karen Duck, Milat's former wife. According to her statement, she met Ivan in the early 1980s when she was still a teenager. The relationship progressed quickly, and within months she had moved into the Milat household. Karen described an environment defined by surveillance, strict rules, and continuous pressure to limit contact with friends and family. She stated that Ivan controlled finances, monitored her movements, and regularly kept firearms accessible inside the home. These accounts aligned with behavioral indicators already noted in Milat's historical record. According to Karen's description, the atmosphere inside the residence deteriorated further after the birth of their daughter. She reported several incidents in which Ivan used weapons to intimidate her during arguments, placing them within reach as a means of asserting dominance. She also stated that he displayed sudden anger when challenged and frequently accused her of disloyalty for minor disagreements. These behaviors, when compared with his earlier criminal history and the methods used in the Belanglo crimes, suggested a long-standing pattern of exerting control through fear. Statements from Karen's relatives added additional context. According to those interviews, family members observed changes in Karen's behavior during the marriage, noting that she appeared increasingly withdrawn and anxious when discussing her home life. Several relatives reported that Karen had attempted to leave multiple times but was discouraged by Milat's threats or assurances that she would not be able to manage independently. These accounts supported investigators' view that the marriage functioned as a controlled environment in which resistance was met with coercion. Additional testimony came from acquaintances who interacted with Milat during that period. According to these statements, he frequently carried knives, spoke openly about firearms, and maintained an interest in remote locations. Several individuals recalled him disappearing for long periods during weekends, often returning with hunting equipment or supplies. Task Force Air reviewed these accounts alongside the established timeline of the backpacker disappearances, noting that the marriage ended in 1989, the same year the earliest known victims vanished. Detectives also examined court files related to the separation. According to those documents, Karen initiated legal action citing intimidation, fear, and concerns for her safety. Although the proceedings did not result in criminal charges, investigators considered the allegations consistent with the broader behavioral patterns documented throughout Milat's history. The separation was finalized in 1989, placing Milat alone and highly mobile during the period directly preceding the murders. By the end of the inquiry, Task Force Air concluded that the behavioral traits observed inside the marriage, control, sudden anger, weapon fixation, and the ability to isolate a partner, corresponded closely with elements present in the Belanglo cases. According to that internal report summarizing these findings, Milat's domestic conduct did not indicate a sudden descent into violence. Instead, it reinforced the growing view that the backpacker murders represented an escalation of behaviors already embedded in his personal life. With both the historical record and domestic testimony supporting the investigative framework, the task force entered its final phase, preparing the case for court. The next step would determine how the findings from the forest, the crime scenes, and decades of behavioral evidence would be presented before a jury in one of the most significant trials in Australian criminal history.
By March 1996, the investigation had moved into the courtroom, with prosecutors preparing a case built on forensic evidence, timeline reconstruction, behavioral history, and the testimony of Paul Onions. According to the filings submitted ahead of the proceedings, the Crown intended to demonstrate that the items recovered from multiple Milat properties, combined with ballistic and fiber analysis, placed Ivan Milat in direct contact with each of the 7 backpackers found in Belanglo State Forest. The trial opened before a packed court, with families arriving from Australia, the United Kingdom, and Germany to hear the evidence collected over years. Prosecutors began by presenting the physical links: a water bottle belonging to Simone Schmidl, clothing traced to Clarke, and a camera linked to Gabor Neugebauer. According to forensic experts called to testify, these items showed signs of having been stored intentionally, not inadvertently mixed with household goods. Analysts also introduced ballistic comparisons showing that projectiles recovered from Clarke and Gibson bore characteristics consistent with a .22 caliber rifle type known to be used by the Milat family, with components recovered from Ivan's residence supporting the match. The testimony of Paul Onions formed a central component of the Crown's narrative.
According to the official transcript, Onions identified Milat in court with the same certainty he displayed during the initial lineup. He recounted the 1990 incident in consistent detail, describing the firearm, the rope, and the circumstances under which he escaped. His evidence provided jurors with a first-hand account of behavior that matched the offender profile in the Belanglo cases, establishing a direct link between Milat and the method used in multiple disappearances. Defense counsel argued that the items found in Milat properties had been passed among family members, claiming no direct proof that Ivan had possession at the time of the murders. According to their submissions, the presence of a firearm component or a backpack did not prove involvement in the offenses. The defense also claimed that investigators had developed tunnel vision once Milat became a suspect, asserting that the evidence could support multiple interpretations. These arguments, however, were countered by prosecutors who highlighted the consistency of Milat's work-related travel, his documented behavior, and the clear alignment between the recovery sites and his movements. After months of testimony, expert reporting, and cross-examinations, the jury returned its verdict in July 1996. Ivan Milat was found guilty of 7 counts of murder, as well as charges related to the attempted abduction of Paul Onions. He received 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. According to the sentencing remarks, the judge described the crimes as among the most disturbing committed in the state, citing their calculated nature and the suffering inflicted on the victims. With the verdict delivered, the case transitioned into its long post-trial phase, marked by appeals, continued investigations, and shifting public sentiment. During his imprisonment, Milat engaged in behavior that underscored his refusal to acknowledge responsibility. According to correctional records, he attempted an escape in 1997, took part in hunger strikes, and in 2009 severed one of his own fingers in an attempt to send it to the High Court. He continued to deny all involvement in the murders, a position he maintained through every legal avenue pursued during his incarceration. Despite repeated interviews by investigators seeking information on additional potential victims, he provided no cooperation. Parallel to the prison years, police continued reviewing unsolved disappearances that bore similarities to the Belanglo cases. According to task force correspondence, several unsolved investigations from the late 1970s through the early 1990s remained under assessment for possible links. While no additional charges were laid, investigators acknowledged that the full scope of Milat's activities may never be known. This uncertainty remained a source of distress for families whose cases resembled Milat's pattern but lacked the evidence required for confirmation. Public sentiment during this period reflected both relief and unresolved concern. According to media commentaries from the time, the verdict brought closure to the confirmed victims' families, many of whom traveled internationally to attend hearings and sentencing. Their statements consistently highlighted gratitude for the investigative efforts, alongside grief at the circumstances of the deaths. For the families of individuals whose cases resembled Milat's pattern but remained unsolved, the verdict provided only partial reassurance. The possibility of additional victims, unable to be conclusively identified, remained a point of ongoing public discussion. Members of the Milat family publicly denied any knowledge of Ivan's involvement and distanced themselves from the crimes. According to their statements, they did not accept the findings of the court and maintained that Ivan had been unfairly targeted. This division created long-term fractures within the family, amplified by the attention surrounding the trial and subsequent prison incidents. Milat's death in October 2019 ended decades of appeals, denials, and public debate. According to correctional records, he died from complications related to cancer while refusing final discussions with investigators. His passing reignited calls for broader reforms, including improved tracking of long-distance hitchhiking, enhanced missing person protocols, and expanded interstate cooperation for high-risk disappearance cases. Law enforcement agencies also adopted new standards for case-linking analytics, in part influenced by the scale and complexity of the Belanglo investigation. In the years following the trial, the backpacker murders remained a defining case in Australian criminal history. Families of the victims continued to advocate for stronger support systems for missing travelers, while the public viewed the case as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by individuals moving through isolated regions. The investigation's legacy included procedural improvements, international cooperation frameworks, and a recognition that the darkest chapters in policing often lead to reforms designed to prevent their repetition. As we close this chapter, we want to hear from you. Do you believe justice was fully served in this case? Were there moments in the investigation or trial that could have been handled better? And what questions still stay with you after hearing the full story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps shape the conversations we build on this channel. If you found this documentary meaningful, make sure to like the video, subscribe to Crime Insider, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive we release. Your support allows us to keep covering the cases that shaped some of the darkest chapters in criminal history.